This is a bit slow today. It started recording. Okay. Good everyone. So today we're looking at SQL servers and Power BI, a match made in heaven. And today our guest speaker is James Sandro. So James will be taking us on SQL servers and Power BI. So the Power BI learning community is being brought to you by UrBizEdge and being sponsored by Enterprise DNA. Enterprise DNA is a Power BI empowered firm, which the main goal is to empower Power BI users to change the world. So they have a lot of learning resources. They have the learning map, the Power BI accelerator. They also have a bunch of courses, and they have this ongoing Power BI challenge, which you should join. Then UrBizEdge is a registered Microsoft Excel, financial modeling, business intelligence, data analysis, and enterprise solution firm in Nigeria. They also specialize in helping companies and professionals be on top of their business data. And they're also the developers of the Nigeria Finance Markets Analyst tool, which is available on the Microsoft Office store. They also have online courses which you could also register and take a part of it. So today our guest speaker is James Andrew, and James is a professional business intelligence analyst. He's also a content creator, and he's also a lover of Power BI, Python, SQL, and everything that has to do with data. And he's also the founder of Matador software, where he creates YouTube tutorial videos which focuses on data analysis and business intelligence. I will share a link to James' YouTube video in the chat description. This YouTube video has about 24 videos. Actually has more than that at the moment. And it ranges from using DAX for heat maps, conditional icons, Power Query, Power Automate, dynamic elements, like I said, everything that has to do with data. Hello, James.
All right, thank you very much. So I am going to take control and share my screen. So please let me know, Benny, in the chat, or just unmute if anything isn't working correctly or my sound, and I will fix that. But yeah, so
yeah,
thanks. Great. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, like you said, we're going to cover SQL Server and Power BI, really SQL and Power BI, I guess, in a way, because I say SQL Server, that's what a lot of people will use. But obviously now with the things moving into the cloud more and more companies adopting that, I use Azure SQL in a professional environment, but really that and SQL Server are almost the same thing. And I think it's always hard. So if I go to my next slide, well, here we go, what we'll cover. It's always hard sort of to frame these things for an audience because you kind of don't know the level of people that are going to join. So definitely in this session, I'm going to look at an overview of SQL Server for those who maybe haven't used it, and SQL in general. And then we're going to go into why we use relational databases and the advantages of using relational databases in SQL with Power BI. And then from sort of a conceptual level, how the business benefits from this. Things like Roche's maxim of data transformation, which is quite interesting. A lot of you may be familiar with, or you may sort of inherently use this without knowing the actual phrasing there. And then how we can get SQL and I guess our data team or our business to do some of the heavy lifting, where it's a bit more intuitive than actually going into Power BI. And then we'll look at things like importing data in, and how we can use things like views to maybe improve our experience in Power BI. From there, I've got a few resources I'll share with you, some good books, and then a question and answer if anyone has any. So before we do that, I'm just going to fix some things. I noticed there's a message, so I'm just going to check. Perfect, it's just Benny. I'm going to turn my camera off because I don't want to distract from what I'm showing you. Usually just do that for the introduction. And we'll go back through into presenter mode. So get rid of that. Here we are, about me. Yeah, Benny kindly shared some information about me, maybe from our last session as well. So the main things that I focus on, and I've seen Nigel and some other contacts from LinkedIn. So great to see you here. I post a lot on LinkedIn. I try to maybe not post solely on, Power BI or specific data technologies quite often. Really what I do is just things that I maybe encounter working in business intelligence and data, or lessons I wish I'd known when I was learning things. I try and share that with the community, because it would have made my journey to, I guess, where I am now a lot shorter. So yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. I'll have some information at the end as well with some of my links, but I think Benny's doing that anyway. So thank you. Yeah, I and the current things I'm really working on now, I'm trying to give people 60-second SQL solutions. So I think it can be a bit complex when people, you're not really familiar and people start talking about a SQL, a MySQL, all these different relational database management systems. It gets a bit confusing. So I'm trying to sort of break down things into use cases and actually make it relevant to people. Yeah, so working on SQL Server quick tips. My Power BI quick tips now has 56, which is strange. I've still got ideas there. And then apart from that, I like to do a bit of automation and data analysis in Python, and provide some general business intelligence and data advice. So check me out there if you want to. But yeah, we've got a session today anyway, so I will move on. So we've went through what we'll cover. And now what I want to do, just to get everyone maybe up to speed, is sort of introduce SQL Server and actually SQL, and explain just how everything sort of relates to each other. And I hope this session is going to have a nice flow to get everyone up to speed in where we maybe want to be in this session. So, like I said, I think initially, especially with things like data analysis, I was attracted into Python and the bright lights and training models, and that was all very cool. But maybe one of the reasons I didn't touch SQL before I touched Python was I just really was a bit confused about the subject. And unfortunately, SQL's got my heart now, but naturally it wasn't one of the sexiest things, you hear about machine learning, artificial intelligence, pandas, all these data analysis libraries for Python as well. But now by far the favorite tool that I use professionally is SQL Server. So I want to go over kind of what SQL is about and what a lot of this terminology means that you probably hear. So SQL is the sort of core of what we do. You can ignore SQL Server and T-SQL and all these phrases for now. SQL, and I call it SQL, you can use SQL, whatever you want. But yeah, it basically just stands for Structured Query Language. And it is a type of programming language. It's a declarative programming language. And basically all you need to know is that SQL is used for communicating with a database, and more specifically, a relational database. So where we get certain amounts of information that may come from a source system. Usually your use case would be an app. So if you build a website, let's say I've got a website for a fitness club, and I want to show, the times of sessions or booking systems and all that, I'm going to have to pull data from some sort of database. So I would need to know some sort of SQL to pull that data through and to host my database. But more specifically, really in the data world, for me, I work for a private healthcare company in my full-time role. So we would have a source app that people go in and get their treatments, and then we take all of that data and we would pull it through to SQL databases via pipelines or whatever. It can be different everywhere. But really, it's just the way that we interact with databases. And I'm going to show you some of this today anyway. So like I said, it could be used for adding, retrieving, or updating data stored in a database and much more. And we can do a lot of the heavy lifting that you may have previously done in Power Query in SQL. And I'm going to go over why that's a good idea. And obviously, I still use Power Query and DAX. They're wonderful tools and languages, but we can start to do things a bit more collaboratively and efficiently if we know SQL. Like I said, it's used across many different types of databases. This could be retail stores, IT companies, oil and gas companies, private healthcare. These are some of the things I've worked on. And yeah, I think there was a statistic that of all the Fortune 100 companies in America, something like 90% use SQL in some variety. So really, out of all your data tools, It's really going to be the one that's the most employable, I would say, and it's been around since 1970, where it was invented. Well, it was invented through IBM by a man called Edgar F. Codd. And if you go deeper into SQL, you'll see normalization forms. So a lot of this is time tested, and there's so much documentation because it's been around for so long. You pretty much know that if you come across an issue, you're going to find an answer. Whereas some of the newer technologies I've been using, when you come across issues, people haven't written about it yet because they haven't come across the issue. So it's valuable in that sense. Now, so there we go. SQL is just how we interact with a database, essentially. Now, SQL Server, this is Microsoft's extension, and you can also, we could insert a slash there and say Azure SQL, which is just the sort of cloud edition, whereas you would say SQL Server is on-premise. So Azure SQL has got advantages being hosted in the cloud. But for the purpose of today, we'll basically say they're essentially the same thing, and they work in much the same way. So yeah, it's a relational database management system. So if we think of SQL as the way that we communicate with a database, we could think of SQL Server in Microsoft as almost the filing system, the specific filing system that we use to host our data, and that's where we'll go in and interact with it using SQL, or T-SQL, which is just Microsoft's extension on that. So there are other relational database management systems. You've got things like MySQL, which you've probably heard of, SQLite, Postgres. However, Postgres is actually, this is maybe beyond today, but it's actually an object-oriented relational database management system, just to bear in mind. So it has a few extra features and it's open source. But yeah, what we know is that SQL Server, especially for today, where we're interacting with Power BI, it's a Microsoft product. It's where we can use SQL and store our data, and it's hugely popular, purely because the amount of organizations that use Microsoft packages. So it would make sense to have a Microsoft database management system there. And then we go on to T-SQL. So like I said, T-SQL will use, so SQL is a standard, it conforms to ANSI standards, so it's standardized. So you can be sure whatever version of SQL you're using, so it may not be T-SQL, it may be, Oracle's version or whatever. It's going to be largely the same, but all these ones, you can think of them as just sort of an accent or a dialect on SQL. So T-SQL, Microsoft's version, might have some extra features, but the things that you're going to use frequently, like select statements, update, delete, these are going to be consistent across other relational database management systems. So I wouldn't worry too much. If you're familiar with just SQL as a core, you would naturally adapt to T-SQL very well. So it's just Microsoft's version of the query language. It has some extensions and some nuances. But if you were to go ahead and just learn SQL Server, you're going to be pretty safe that you can adapt to any, if your company or you in a learning project dive into another relational database management system, you'll be fine. So yeah, like I said, just think of T-SQL as the dialect. So I'm aware this is quite confusing. To get this in one more time, SQL is how you interact with a database, a relational database. SQL Server is just Microsoft's sort of filing system as to where you store the data. And T-SQL is just a bit of an extension onto SQL that Microsoft use. So that's just the overview for anyone who previously hasn't used SQL before. So why do we use relational databases? Maybe the next question as we start to dive into things. And here is where I wanted to introduce a bit of Power BI in, because naturally we're speaking about the two things in time here. So this is a star schema model. It's an illustration from the Microsoft documentation. Now, you'll know when you use Power BI that if we want to make any tables connect to each other and speak to each other, we have to use the data modeling tool in order to do that. And the most efficient way that you do that in Microsoft is with what Microsoft would term a star schema, or you could think of it as a dimensional data model, something that's been around for a long time through Ralph Kimball and the Kimball methodology, and that'll be referenced in one of my resources. So what does this have to do with SQL databases would be a very good question. Now, the way that we typically, when we're working in Power BI, we connect these different dimensions. So you can see I would have a fact table here where it's just, this is a lot of the fast moving transactional data. You know, things like we've got our sales numbers, we've got, you know, so we can track our sales, we've got the territories, order quantities, and so on. Well, we need to connect these to other pieces of data. And basically what we're doing here, likely someone within a database has, or even in Power BI, has broken these apart into dimensions, where it means that we get rid of a lot of the, we're able to get rid of a lot of the fluff or redundant data. So basically we can start to connect things up. So you see in my fact table, I have a date key that would correspond with a date key in this table, and we could connect it up that way. So now we have a dimension, so we can start to just view things by date, and we can pull from different tables because everything's connected up. Now it would be the same here in the employee. We have an employee key, and we would expect that somewhere in here we would have there, we have an employee key. So we're starting to go into things that we call primary keys and foreign keys, where a primary key is just your sort of key column in this employee table, and we could connect it in with this fact table. And again, that's just how, if you've used Power BI, essentially that's how we want to build things and connect things. We want a solid data model. But the good thing is, relational databases takes a lot of this work away from having to think about this and construct it in Power BI. Because if Joe blogs, let's say from our IT department, and we're sitting in the data department, chucks some information at us and says, all right, we need to view this employee information by date, by orders, whatever. It's going to be quite difficult to do if we don't have a solid foundation. So one of the ways we can ensure that's pretty much ready to go is within a relational database. And you can assume that when we talk about a relational database, that's just a SQL database, because everything's sort of, one of the really the key parts of using a SQL database is being able to join different tables together. So with that background knowledge in mind, why do we use relational databases? Just basically, if you were using Excel and Power BI in your current role, and you were to say to me, James, you know, we got something that's okay here, why should we use a SQL database? This is what I would tell you. So first of all, it's intuitive. It's very easy to understand the information that's present within SQL, because we just have sort of tables loaded in. And this is usually, remember I said it's probably going to come from some sort of source system. So if we go back to that retail analogy, I might work for a big supermarket chain, a big food shop. And I would typically get lots of information in. So that might be about my customers. It might be, you know, the sales for the day. It might be by region. And the way that this typically, we would bring this into SQL and break these tables down, it becomes very intuitive as to where we need to actually get our information and interact with it. And then we can look at things like, you know, distributing the correct queries or bringing this into Power BI. It's readable. So again, when we'll look at SQL Server Management Studio, again, another SQL term, but you will get your head around that, which is just, again, a tool that we use to sort of visualize the data that's held in SQL Server. And it's just very efficient and readable and easy to navigate. Now, a huge part here, and this is where we start to link to, you know, our very basic star schema here from the Microsoft documentation, is we can set up constraints and referential integrity. So like we've got in the italics here, referential integrity refers to that data accuracy and consistency. And we can guarantee this with primary and foreign keys. So for example, here you can see one of my primary keys here is employee key. Well, you know that because I've had to join everything together by a common link, that key, you know that if I'm referencing an employee key somewhere, I've got an established relationship and I know that the information is there and it's not prone to errors. Now, if you went into Power BI, let's say with a load of CSV, Excel sheets, you know, maybe SharePoint lists, unfortunately there becomes a point where there's a lot of manual intervention, and that can become difficult to guarantee data quality. And it's great if you're learning or you're working on your own, absolutely fine. You're usually pretty safe. that your data will be okay in terms of the quality or accuracy. But if you start to work in a company where we're now interacting, with stakeholders who don't really understand data and they're populating SharePoint lists, or you have people from IT sending you Excel exports, but they don't really understand the things that we need to be mindful of in really having accurate data, then it becomes really problematic if you haven't guaranteed that referential integrity. Now, the other advantage, if you set this up in SQL Server, let's say, you know that when you import this into Power BI as well, you pretty much know how your data model is going to look already. You don't need to worry about connecting things and whether they're correct. You've done that step. Normalization, and basically what normalization means is reducing data redundancy. And that's hugely important in Power BI. So if I was to take in a massive flat file, let's say we've got something like 2 million rows, which in SQL terms isn't a lot at all, but it would be if you had a large flat file, let's say 10 million rows, which really isn't uncommon in a business case. It would be very tricky to have a really efficient data model, and that's going to slow things down, because within that huge flat file that's very wide in columns and very long, what's going to happen is we're going to have a lot of redundant data that doesn't need to be there, which naturally takes up storage space when we import it into Power BI. However, if we're able like this to, implement tables in SQL with keys, we've got some constraints, we know that we're removing that redundant data. And when we take it into Power BI, it's going to be lightning fast and performant. So that's hugely important. And normalization is something that we have a huge amount of normal forms, and there's a lot of documentation on this. So it sounds like quite a scary word, but it's really not, and it's imperative to actually making things work well in Power BI. Security, again, we can enable some security from the SQL side, because we might have people that aren't actually interested in using Power BI. They just want quick queries from their data, and they don't really need huge reports visualized. It's flexible. So what I mean by that is not flexible in the bad way where there's no constraints, flexible in the good way that we can sort of adapt things down the line. We can join tables together, we can do some merges, we can then begin to sort of tear apart our data and shape it as we want, like we would in Power Query. It's time tested, yet huge amount of documentation available because this has been on the go since 1970. Not SQL Server, but SQL. So you can guarantee that in a forum somewhere, someone's experienced the issue that you're having, or you usually can, unless it was an extreme edge case. It's traceable, so we'll go through this. I've got a whiteboard we're going to go into next. But if you start with data in a source system, let's say we have our supermarket app that's just called shop app, and then it goes into sort of SharePoint lists or CSVs. It's exported down different channels, goes into Power BI reports somewhere, someone in the BI team's giving out the information. It would be very hard with all those changes to see where that information originated from. So when someone says, uh-oh, we've got key customer data that's gone out to one of our other customers, that'd be a huge issue, and it would just become a really messy situation. So you want to really keep track of where things are stemming from, and you'll want to see comparisons on your data day by day or month by month, and that's going to be much easier if we have a rigid relational database. And the last thing, like I said, it's straightforward and easy to read and model. So when you go into your data modeling in Power BI, a lot of the work's already done. So with that in mind, yes.
Yeah, so there's a question. So someone was raising their hands up. Okay. So he'll talk, but there's a question before the other question. So the first question was someone said that some companies take security very important, and business intelligence analysts are limited to the privilege given in the database environment. That you think a Power BI or a business intelligence analyst should be given admin access or admin privilege to database to allow them to do their job, or should it be regulated?
No, absolutely. So, for example, I wouldn't touch the tools if I didn't have full administration access, and the reason for that, and I know I don't know who asked that because I'm presenting, but I know that in a lot of companies, IT will take that responsibility. Now, the issue is IT don't really have the knowledge of data that we do as business intelligence analysts and data professionals. So if they're implementing something, they need our input and our consideration. And likewise, we need full administration in the tool because we likely know the best procedures. So yeah, definitely you want full access.
Thank you.
And yeah, as a data professional, your security shouldn't be, it should be assumed that you won't abuse that.
Yeah, so I think it's a complaint. So Mr. Bello said that, so that can actually be very frustrating. So I think he has been in a situation like that. So there's another question for Mr. Balogu. You can unmute yourself and ask. Hi. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
See.
So Mr. Balogu, you can unmute yourself. You should be able to unmute now and just ask.
I think it might have been this question that he's typed out, maybe.
Okay, no, this is from someone else. Okay, let us continue with the webinar. Maybe it's a mistake or something.
Yeah, no problem.
I was unmuted. Good evening. Hi, James. Thanks for the information you've given so far. I just have a quick question. You talked about normalization. I really don't understand what that means. I would appreciate if you could explain again. But what I understood or what I got from what you said is having like a, what's it called?
So I will, before I move on, I'll essentially, without going into too much depth, basically we have a lot of normal forms, and when we use normalization, what we're doing is like I said, we're removing some of that data redundancy. So we're removing some of that duplication and some of that data that we don't require and ensuring data integrity. And there's several different levels of normal form. Usually you want to get to third normal form, but you can research this. There's a lot of content there, just so it doesn't interrupt the flow of the session. But yeah, and basically before you can get to the next normal form, you need to have complied to everything in the normal form that came before. But yeah, just think of it as reducing data redundancy for now. So I should still be presenting, and I'm going to go to my whiteboard quickly to show you something before we go into the SQL environment. So this was actually from something else I did on SQL Views, but I feel like this is quite a helpful illustration of where SQL comes in handy. And like I said, there's the Roche's maximum of data transformation, which is very well known in the industry, but it's very accurate. So data should be transformed as far upstream as possible and as far downstream as necessary. So if we think as upstream as possible, let me get my pen tool out, and my writing's a bit dodgy here, but here we are. This here would be as far upstream as we can get because this is where the data originates. So someone goes into our shop website, they produce an order, and within the app, then they collect the data on, what I've ordered, when I ordered it, all the good reporting stuff, what region I'm from, my customer ID maybe. And downstream would be right here. In another case, if we're in the business environment, that would be the end user. That's really who gets the information at the end of the day. So where we would be usually, and it's a good question because we mentioned the difference between sort of IT and data sometimes, which I think is it's not always as clear as black or white. There's a lot of gray areas where people do both, but really your source app here is going to be governed by the really the IT team or developers, and usually where we would sit as data professionals or business intelligence analysts would be in here. So We may have a bit of knowledge here about how things work, and we're going to need to, because we're going to have to translate that into our data sort of considerations. But this is where we would sit right here. And typically, what happens is we have a source app, and this goes into what I would call a staging environment. So this would be my SQL database, you know, my data warehouse. And what happens here is in the source app, there's just essentially transactional data. You know, James from this shop X, James bought carrots, whatever. I spent 50 Great British pounds. You know, I'm from this region. And then we take it into SQL and we begin to organize this data. And we can query it, analyze it, and get it ready for shaping, again, to go down these platforms. Now, this is basic, but typically the two things that I would usually see is that either people from me would want, they have an ad hoc data request. So they say, I'm sitting at my desk, and they say, hey, James, you know, I manage a customer, and they're asking questions about their employees, and they want to know what happened on this date. So I can go, right, cool. I'll go into my SQL environment. I write a quick query. There you go. There's your information. And they don't need anything more. They didn't need a report. But I could have someone who's an executive or a director or a manager who says, hey, James, look, we need to look at this information every day and get some call to action, because we don't think that the company's performing in this way. And I go, right, well, this is a bit more complex. Maybe I need to try and display some sort of correlation as to why this is happening. Great, you've got some metrics. I can keep this here. We can update the data, and you can look at this every day. And that's sort of self-service business intelligence, where we do it once and we just give it to the director, or we make it available in the Power BI service, and then it comes back to the end user. Now, an issue that we typically have when we're thinking of Roche's maxim of transforming things upstream is that things can become very fragmented. Let's say we didn't have a SQL environment. Maybe we use Excel. So we'll just use EX because it would take me forever to write with that pen tool. Excel maybe, and then we start to be able to get people their ad hoc requests, but then maybe in Power BI, companies are using a SharePoint environment, which again is better than a lot of things, but it's prone to errors. But then this information that really could be contained together, or would be in a SQL environment, we're almost having to do double the work. And then you think about, well, we could actually have a different step here where we've got Power Query to transform our data, or DAX maybe. So you can see how this gets very messy very quickly. So one solution could be that we actually implement our database, and what we can do is we sort of know the flavor or the appetite that the business has and the certain types of data requests they submit. So we can use SQL, and then we can, what we'll look at, we can have something called SQL Views maybe, which are a very performant way to bring data into Power BI, because you reduce a lot of that clutter, that duplication, that fuzzy data that we don't really need. So by having a solid SQL environment, we can actually stick to that maxim where we're transforming things as far upstream, because I could write a really logical 5-line query in SQL maybe, or I could have a, you know, more complex stored procedures or something, but I'm going to be able to do that very efficiently rather than going into Power Query, which again is an amazing tool. There's no disrespect there. I'm just trying to show you can be efficient, and having to, you know, implement 10 or 20 logical steps, rename everything. I need to trim columns. I need certain custom M code. And the other thing, if you work in a large organization, or maybe not such a large organization, you can pretty much guarantee that you're going to have people who are experienced in SQL in the data department. What you can't guarantee, let's say you're just implementing Power BI, or you've only had it for about a year, is that people are going to be really well versed in Power Query. So by transforming things upstream, and you might have issues in SQL that you say, hey, actually, you know, we're having to fix this as a data department, but really this isn't our issue, because what's happened is the IT team down the line, in development, they never thought about why we shouldn't have null values, or they didn't think about why they shouldn't have hard-coded elements for people to enter. So let's say in my, we've got a sort of healthcare app and we want to monitor why people are getting certain types of appointments. Now, the trouble is people are just allowed to enter, sore head or sore leg, but that doesn't help us when we're actually analyzing data. We would want more concrete categories like leg injury, maybe, and sore head could come under sort of minor injury. I don't know. So, and this is the point that I made earlier about IT shouldn't hold all the keys to the data department, because we have things that they might never consider, and likewise they have information that we don't know about. That's fine. That's why we're experts in our own fields. So there's a lot of value to structuring your data in SQL and sort of trying to be as efficient as possible upstream. Now, I will just check my presentation, but I believe we're actually going to head into SQL Server Management Studio anyway. Yes, so I do see that we have a question, so let me check. Here we go. Sometimes database performance can be slow due to internal apps connecting to the database. How can we mitigate its impact on the Power BI report? So if we're talking about our database performance, as in your relational database management system, so let's say it's SQL Server, you really need to cut things at source. So I would try my best to, almost build boundaries as to where those internal apps can connect. And sometimes, it's obviously hard for me to answer without full specifics. And I'm sure this is probably professional, so you can't share. But really, sometimes you just have to accept these things. But really, anything that you can do to speed up performance is the primary goal in SQL and relational databases. Everything has a storage cost, has a performance cost. And with SQL, that's sort of, once you get good at querying and things, that's really where you need to focus your attention. Yeah, apologies, without having a full sort of use case, it's hard for me to answer that one. But what I want to do now is move into my SQL environment. And there's a few things that I want to discuss here. So this maybe looks overwhelming if you haven't used it, but like I said, this is what's known as SQL Server Management Studio, and it's just an express free version I have. So one thing to note here, you can connect this to SQL Server just when you log in, your standard on-prem or Azure SQL. Professionally, I would use Azure SQL. It's just a slightly different way of logging in, but you can connect to, databases in the cloud, and just think of SQL Server Management Studio as a sort of the GUI, the interface that you use just to view things. That's really all it is. And there's a few nice security settings and things as well. So, like I said to you, this is a sample database called Northwind that Microsoft.
Let them move this thing now.
All right. I think that was someone who forgot to mute. But anyway, like I said, so if you have a source system, the chances are what your information will come in will look like this. And this is actually more refined in the sense that this is our categories data. So really what would happen, just to give you a full spectrum, is you would have your source app, and typically what you would do, you would create a pipeline into SQL Server. A pipeline is just a way of migrating data. There's a lot of ways to do this. Two of the most common would be SQL Server integration systems, if you're still using on-prem. What I've been using more, which is very good in cloud, is Azure Data Factory. But just think of it as a method to take data from one place to another. And then what we would do is we would, house our data here within Azure SQL, within SQL Server Management Studio as our GUI. And then we just pull the information into Power BI. But to show you from the offset, if I just take my categories data and execute, you can see that, this is actually more dimensional in nature. Let's see if I can go into my databases in Northwind here. And yeah, probably order details is going to be a more transactional type of column. So again, we've got our order ID, our product ID, the unit price, quantity, any discount applied. And let's look at one more table, maybe orders. And you can see that this is much more transactional in nature. So when I say a staging area, typically we want to start to shape things. Now, we're not going to recreate tables, but we've got a number of querying tools at our disposal to change this, because if I was to pull this into Power BI, let's say, and like I said, it would be common that you could have over 10 million rows of this type of data. And remember, it's going to grow every day, because every day there's going to be, you know, maybe 100,000 transactions. So I have an order ID, customer ID, and so on. And I've just selected the top 1,000 rows equally. So like I said to you, in SQL, very easy to do. And this is common across all, not just T-SQL, all sort of variations of SQL. You can just say select all, star means all. From orders, close it off with a terminator, which is my semicolon, and execute. And then you get all of the transactional information. So already at our disposal, like I said, it was very quick to source this, where I knew what my database was, Northwind, and then here I can really see the information I'm after. Orders, query it, there we go. And I think that first select all statement kind of opened your eyes to a lot of possibility. Now, we've also got, let's say I remove, I will answer that question at the end, because we're running out of time, but there's not much to go. So I can select all from categories and products together. And, you know, this is like we would have in Power BI. It's almost set up in the way that we would want. So you can see that if you were to build your Power BI data model, well, you're going to need a common link to link these two tables together, aren't you? And that's what you do. You build relationships. Well, relationship isn't a new term. It's not a Power BI thing. It's been on the go with relational databases for a long time. So, for example, I could use my category ID from within categories, and we're going to look at this in a minute. And it's also available in my products table. Now, the issue is, in this categories table, you know, there's nothing here of any, what can I analyze here? I've got great, you know, my beverages are soft drinks, cool. I don't really care about that, because it's not going to help anyone gain insight or improve our business. But what I could do is link to the products table, and now we can start to see by category. All right, well, what have we got here? We've got all sorts of information that we can look at. We've got unit prices, units in stock, what we need to order, maybe where we're failing with our reorders, and you can then, you know, this is where people are going to really want to know information. So I'm going to show you a view in a second, but let me just show you here. Now, this is a simple SQL query, but I want to show you this because you could create this into a view and just take it into Power BI. And what this is actually going to do is take away so many of that Power Query steps that, you know, wouldn't be necessary if we were to do this. So if we were to execute this query, and we're going to look at making a view in a second, we could make a view in SQL, and that's one of the best ways to bring data into Power BI. You can use tables, but it's not as performant sometimes. But what I've done here, by typing a few lines, I've actually taken the category ID that we saw before. I've managed to rename it as category ID with spaces, because naturally in Power BI, you're going to have that. It's going to be more readable for the general user. And I've taken the average of the unit price as the average price. Now, in Power BI, you'd have to take that into Power Query or DAX, whatever your preference would be, and you've got to implement steps. I've also managed to group this data by the category ID. If we didn't group it, we would just have a list of products, a list of different products, you know, and their relative category ID, and having, which is just a filter mechanism where I've said where the average unit price is greater than 25. So you had a Power BI report that's already established maybe, and someone said, hey, I want my products by category ID. I want to see their average unit price. I want you grouping them by category ID, and I want an average unit price over 25. It's very logical to do in SQL. Whereas in Power BI and Power Query, it can be a bit more, you might have to implement more steps. And also, maybe this is something that someone's going to come back to you regularly, just for a quick ad hoc query. So we could save this as a view or take it into Power BI, and we almost have that, you know, that kill birds with two stones, kill two birds with one stone mentality there. It's efficient. Now, this is actually just a simple script that I used to create a view called product categories. again. So what I've done is basically here I've got a simple SQL query where I've, like we saw before, and I'll show you what this looks like. I've joined the products and the categories table together, but I only wanted to show the category name, product name, the units in stock, and whether it's discontinued. And this here, this flag, this the two operators just means where it's not equal to 1. So where it's a flag of 0, which typically where 0 and 1 when you're using it in data, 0 would mean that it's not discontinued. So there we go. It's your false flag. Now we've done that and we've saved it as a view. I can check it. And now what I've actually done is taken two tables and I've done my data shaping in SQL Server. So I've got my category name, my product name, the units in stock, and I'm just checking that everything worked, that's not discontinued. You don't need to have that field in, and we could have more fields. Whereas before, we had this information. And it just really wasn't, it came from a transactional source system. It wasn't in the state to be analyzed. But now I can do this in SQL Server. I've saved it as a view where it doesn't consume memory. It's just a snapshot of my query, but I can still bring it into Power BI or access it in SQL. And I don't have to worry about potentially going in and changing my whole Power BI report. So if I was to show you, this was called product categories. I could go into Power BI and we've got the standard SQL Server connection. You know, you don't even have to go into the get data. So SQL Server, that will load up. And just to simply do this, I have this is my SQL Server name for my free SQL Express account. And this is one thing you need to bear in mind. You can either go into import or direct query. And in layman's terms, this just depends on really how big your data sets are and how frequently you want them to update. So let's say that I had a huge, massive, you know, we're talking hundreds of millions of rows, and someone wants it. So let's say we have a really fast moving manufacturing company. They want to see their data every 5 minutes update. Well, we're going to need to use direct query. But really, in the majority of situations, you will use import because you don't need to have that level being updated. For a lot of people, 1 or 2 times a day is fine, or one overnight refresh. So, and actually import gives you more flexibility, and in direct query, you would need to query things with SQL, which then gets converted into logical steps in Power BI. Import's a lot nicer, and it's just how you would take things in with Excel as well. So again, I'm going to import my whole server in. This would just take a second to load. And here we go. I've got my Northwind database that we looked at, and you can see product categories. Whereas if I was just to import those tables, remember, and I have spoken to my stakeholders, they have assured me that the data in the product categories is actually all they wanted. Well, why would I take in 2 tables, product and customers, have to link them in my data model? Then I have to think about that redundant data. Let's say, like I said, we have millions of rows. Well, that's going to affect performance because you're bringing in extra data. When I could just simply bring in a view, and you'll notice the difference between the view icon and the table. I've got my product categories. I don't need to worry about my preview. I know that it's safe to load because I've done this in SQL. That'll create a connection to my SQL Server. It will just take a second. Simple 69 rows, not a large amount of data. And there we go. Now in Power BI, I have category name, my product name, units in stock, discontinued. Now think if I brought those 2 extra tables in, I would be currently implementing steps in Power Query. I'd have taken data in because I wasn't sure if people needed it in the future, and I'm going to really impact performance. So views are incredibly helpful. And the other thing that they can do, I didn't do it here, but you saw in the first example, my query, I can actually just start to rename things and alias them. So I could include spaces here, whereas again, I'd have to take that step in my Power Query by adding spaces to my columns. So yeah, incredibly helpful views. Now, I'm aware before we close off for some Q&A that some of you may not be well versed in SQL, and that's completely fine. Really intuitive thing to learn. I would think of it as Lego blocks and that it's declarative, so you're sort of just building on previous steps. And when you get into the more complex programmability elements like store procedures, it's really the same concept. So these are some of my favorite resources. Microsoft SQL Server 2012 Bible, don't be put off by 2012. It's 1,400 pages, it's mammoth, but I've never come across a book, really in Power BI either, or other data concepts that's so comprehensive, which can take you from a complete beginner to really advanced edge cases. Great book again for the beginner, T-SQL Fundamentals, focus on your sort of writing out SQL queries, and then again into some of the security and programmability elements. And the Data Warehouse Toolkit, massively important. Ralph Kimball methodology, the founder of the star schema or the dimensional model. He would phrase it the dimensional model, but it's commonly known as star schema, and really imperative to what we do in Power BI. But a lot of these concepts that you see in Power BI and data modeling are born out of SQL. So these go really well hand in hand. If you did want a Power BI, there's the the expert guide to Power BI modeling. I can't remember the actual name of the title, but it's a good resource. So yeah, I would just encourage you to learn. And YouTube obviously is saturated with great resources. There'd be too many to mention here. So I hope that gave you a good example into really more of the theory behind why SQL is really helpful in actual real business use cases. And that little time in SQL Server Management Studio sort of inspired you to try some things out. So here we go. I am now available for a Q&A. There's my socials. I think Benny shared them if you do want to connect. My Twitter is more me, maybe gentle rants, or I'm a bit of an ideas factory, so it might just be an explosion of ideas on there. But yeah, YouTube and LinkedIn is where it's probably best to reach me. So yeah, Q&A, if we have any, I will stop presenting.
Yes. So James, thank you so much for this session. And I think everybody actually learns a lot. I actually personally also learned a lot. There are actually a lot of questions, some Q&A questions. So if you have any questions beside the ones in the chat box, you could just raise the hand and I'll unmute you. Then, so the first question is, so where would query folding come in?
I've seen one here as well. I think that got lost in between the link to downloading SQL Server. I'll send that in. Because it's
the link. Oh yeah, I sent him the link to
download perfect.
And he also have a lot of compliments as well.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for attending. Cheers, Nigel. I just saw that. All right, so yeah, where does query folding come in? Here we go. Yeah, so query folding would come into, so if you were using the direct query mode, whereas we looked at import, if you had to use direct query to constantly speak to the database for fast moving information, that's where query folding comes in.
Oh, okay. So I've sent link to his James YouTube channel, so you should subscribe, so whenever he drops a new video, you actually get the notification. So there's another question again, also again from Bello. So could you explain the concept of Dura and direct query connection to SQL database? Like when you use direct query, where you use direct query?
So basically, yeah, like I said, you're going to want direct query if you have information that is large and needs to be refreshed frequently, and you want to get information from that source. But there are restrictions where you'll have to write in SQL queries to get that information. And it's not something that I really use just because I've never had the requirement to use it. I've never worked anywhere where they want to view data with that amount of frequency. So for me, imports always worked, is my answer.
Okay, so there are more questions. So that question is, okay, so differentiate between the views, storage, procedure, and function.
Yeah, so views does not take any, it does not consume storage unless it's indexed. So it's just that snapshot that we can keep within SQL Server Management Studio. And like I say, we can import it, or we can go back, we can query it, and we can look at that information in the way that we shaped it without consuming memory. stored procedures. So that would be when we want to do something sort of programmatically. So maybe I want to take a certain amount of information, I want to shape it, and then I want to, insert it into another table. If I want that logical flow where I'm performing many actions and execute it, I would likely use a stored procedure. And function, so a function would be something like, we could have, there's date time functions like you would almost have in Power BI, date add. These would be specific things that we would provide parameters for. So maybe I want to take the year out of a date and reflect that in my query. Well, I would use a function with the argument with the current date. So yeah, that's a pretty simple explanation to those things. And with the views, I see there's another question. With the views, will refresh be automatic? Yes. Well, this is a great thing about views. It's completely underpinned by the underlying data. So it only actually, it's completely dependent on the queries. So like we say, the Northwind database is old and it's a sample. But if you have data that's fast moving, refresh is automatic. And also a great thing about views is that, if you connect to the view in Power BI as it's linked to the underpinned data, that things aren't going to break as frequently as, if you reference source items from, let's say, an Excel CSV, or the namings changes, you'll see that your visualizations break. Well, that's not going to happen with views because it's completely dependent on underlying database data. So yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. I don't even any other question. Okay, so there's one more question from Bello. Bello had a lot of questions today.
Oh, that's great.
Hello, Bello. She wrote to unmute. Okay, City also work with Power BI.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, James. Thank you very much for that wonderful session. It was quite informative and quite engaging. I really loved it. In addition to what you've just said, I was just looking at some of the things that I have seen myself on the job. And one of the things that I realized using a view, sometimes some of the query could be expensive on a database and it takes time for it to actually give you a result. So what we normally do sometimes is to create a temporary table on the database where we just like dump all of those information on and we can carry on our analysis from that temporary table. With that, it's basically just help with other applications connecting to the database, and also it reduced downtime on our applications. So I just thought it's best I just share that in addition to what you said, and I really appreciate what you've done. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, that's a great, with the temporary table, that's a great solution. And like we say, different use cases. The only issue with the temporary table is it's going to consume SQL storage space. But if you've got the ability to do that, fantastic, yeah. Whereas the views in your actual database won't consume the storage space unless they're indexed. But yeah, great advice. And also I saw someone ask if they can use CTEs in Power BI. You would naturally go for Mohammed's solution and use a temporary table over a CTE.
Then, okay, another question is, okay. So can you call it Oracle database with Power BI? Like, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I know that there's connectors for MySQL. I've never used Oracle. Yeah, I've never had to use Oracle. I guess I can quickly check. There might be a different form of connection as well, like an ODBC. I'm not sure. Oracle.
I think it does connect to Oracle
yes.
as well, but it has some APIs that you need to use.
Okay. Yeah, I do see if you go to your standard get data, you can, but yeah, I think you're right. Due to some deprecation, you might need to use an API, so it's a bit more complex. And I think just because Oracle's is, it's fallen out of favor a little bit along the years, but yeah, I imagine you can. Yeah.
So, are there any other questions? If there are none. So there are no other questions. James, thank you so much for the session. It was really informative and insightful.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
So I'll be ending the session right now. The recording will be made available on YouTube. And I also posted links so you can connect with James by subscribing to his YouTube channel or even connect with him on LinkedIn as well. Then for the video will be made available on YouTube. So I'll post the link right now in the chat description. Okay. Right, so see everybody same time next week. And thank you once again, James, for this session.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for your work, Benny. Always appreciate seeing the videos. Thank you very much.
Thank you.